Welcome to this episode of Wayfinders. Let's go. Well, today we're going to meet Matthew Jorgensen, Matt, an Australian marketing professional who comes from Nowra, a coastal town about 2.5 hours south of Sydney. Growing up in this regional area, Matt was surrounded by a mix of industry and natural beauty. Completing his education at the University of Wollongong, Matt moved to Sydney and began his career in brand and communications research and strategic advisory. And for 6 years, Matt steadily climbed the ranks of global research firms. Despite this professional success, Matt felt unsettled in Sydney, as he explains.
It was funny, I had moved to Sydney and probably for quite a number of years actually, didn't ever really feel like home to me. So it was just somewhere I lived. And I think it was also because I was new at the time, or newer to the city, but also didn't have, I guess, the networks and things that I saw a lot of other people have.
Well, this sense of disconnection, coupled with a desire for personal growth and new experiences, ultimately led Matt to embark on a transformative 3-year journey to Germany. In Germany, Matt faced numerous challenges, from navigating daily life with limited language skills, at the beginning certainly, to adapting to new and different work cultures. He persevered, and he improved his German to an extent that he could present and engage with his clients in German, which is massively impressive, let me tell you. Reflecting on these experiences, Matt shared a profound insight as follows.
I think I don't want to say I became a different person, but I evolved, I think, a lot over those 3 years. It taught me a lot about resilience. And I think having grown up in yes, I'd moved from the South Coast to Sydney, but my entire life kind of existed in a very small space of, it's a 2-hour drive, it's not like things are that far away. And all of a sudden you kind of thrust to the other side of the world on your own without any kind of friends or network, and you kind of got to make it by yourself. It does teach you a lot about resilience and kind of, just getting on with it.
Well, throughout Matt's time abroad, he built independence and a deep appreciation for cultural diversity. The smallness of our own country can blind us to just how amazing and diverse the world is. He overcame language barriers, starting with how to say the word for coat hanger, so he could put his clothes up in his wardrobe on his first day. He built new social connections, which he has to this day, and he became incredibly powerful and a big asset to his employer in Germany. Perhaps ironically, or even beautifully, you could say, it was Matt's time away that helped him appreciate Sydney more, ultimately influencing his decision to, after 3 years away, return to Australia with a renewed sense of home and purpose. It's a wonderful story, so let's go and meet Matt now. Let's go. Matt, welcome to the Wayfinders podcast. It's great to have you join us today.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm really excited to be here, and I think it's such a great and interesting space that you're kind of venturing into with this podcast. So I'm excited to be part of it.
Oh, thank you. Now we're going to be talking quite a bit about Germany today, I think, and probably also a bit about Australia, a bit about regional New South Wales as well. But full disclaimer, we know each other, don't we? We've been colleagues in the past. It's 15 years now, I think.
Gosh, a long time ago. Yeah, it probably is something like that, 15 years.
2009 in Sydney.
Yes, that's right.
2009 in Sydney. That was an interesting experience, because I was coming back from China to my home, Australia, and maybe we're going to touch on themes of repatriation as well when we talk about your journey. But first, Matt, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? Who
Sure.
is Matt Jorgensen? Your journey, your life until today in 30 seconds or so.
I'll try my best to distill 40 odd years. So yeah, I'm originally from South Coast, New South Wales, from regional New South Wales, as you mentioned, from a town called Nowra,
Mm.
which is about 2.5 hours drive south of Sydney. My family are all still there. Grew up there, moved to Wollongong, went to university at UOW, and then started my career in Sydney. And then I guess probably what we'll spend most of the time talking about today is I did spend about 3 years living and working in Germany. And then after about 3 years, decided to make the move back to Australia. And I've been here since. So kind of back home here in Sydney. And yeah, it's been quite the adventure, you could
I can
say.
imagine. And Matt, for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Nowra and also what it's like to live in regional Australia, could you give a bit of a flavour of where you're from and the population, what people do there? What would it be like spending a week in Nowra?
Yeah, well, so Nowra is a town, as I said, it's about 2.5 hours drive south of Sydney. And look, it's a great spot to grow up, to be honest.
Mm.
It's one of those things when you're young and you're growing up there, you don't tend to really appreciate it. But these days, as an adult, going back down there and getting out of the city, it's a great spot to head to and just kind of disconnect from the craziness of Sydney. Yeah, it's a coastal town. So it's about 15-20 minute drive to the beach from Nowra. Going back in time, it used to be quite an industrial town, and it still is to some extent today. It's a very large dairy area, so there was a milk co-op, dairy
Mm.
co-op there. Australian Paper had a big factory there. Mirror have a plant there still today that produces ethanol. So there's a lot of that kind of, I guess, industrial history.
So you're like the black sheep of the family. You've left Nowra, you've gone to university in Wollongong, which
hmm
it's a great. I have a very good friend in Wollongong. I've spent quite a bit of time there. It's a lovely place. And then to Sydney, and then to Germany and back.
I definitely feel sometimes I am a little bit like that black sheep in the sense
Yeah,
because I didn't work in the family business. My parents and my brother did, and I moved to Sydney. So yeah, I'm a little bit
yeah.
the odd one out.
What was the pull or the push, or what were the kind of motivations that got you to Sydney all those years?
I mean, growing up in Nowra, I don't know, I knew I didn't want to be a Nowra. As I said, there's a lot of kind of industry and,
Mm.
farming and things like that. And I knew those sectors were not really for me. And to be honest, when I finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I'd always had an interest in kind of business, brands, that kind of thing. So it was a bit of a pull to go to university because I guess I was interested in kind of expanding my horizons a bit, trying
Mm.
to think about, where life would take me. And as I
Mm.
said, brand and communications and that kind of thing was sort of something I was interested in. So I ended up doing a commerce degree with, majors in marketing and management. Um,
Mm.
and then from there, I guess it was always, I guess, a natural transition in terms of the sort of sphere and job market
Mm.
was to head to Sydney. But I'd always, I think, deep down, kind of considered myself more of a city person.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
so
right.
it was a bit of a natural kind of pull for me to kind of move to Sydney. I had moved to Sydney and probably for quite a number of years actually didn't ever really feel like home to me.
Mm.
So it was just somewhere I lived.
Yeah.
And I think it was also because I was new at the time or newer
Mm.
to the city, but also didn't have, I guess, the networks and things that I saw a lot of other people have. So I didn't go to school here. I didn't go to
Yeah.
university here. So a lot of those kind of networks that people had built through their life, I didn't
Mm.
necessarily have. And I did
Yeah.
feel as though like a lot of my life was still, on the
Mm.
South Coast.
You know,
Um,
Matt, it's funny. I read this book once. I think I was in Canberra at the time, but it spoke about kind of Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra, and the
mhm.
questions that people ask you. So in Sydney, they'll ask you, "Where did you go? Where did you go to school?" In Melbourne, they ask you, "What do you do?" In Canberra, they ask you, "How long are you staying for?" Because everyone's so
Yes.
transient. But I bring this up because my time in Sydney as well, back in 2009. So I'm from Melbourne. I found it really different,
Mm,
and I got to be honest, I didn't find it very welcoming. Now, it's probably a good segue to kind of start talking about what was it that what was your motivation for upping home and
mm,
moving halfway around the world? So by all accounts, it sounds like life is really great. You've moved from Nowra. You've got a great qualification. You've got a job in the heart of business and marketing in Australia, in a good firm, a global firm. Miller Brown was now it's part of Kantar, and you're in Sydney. The salaries are the best in Australia. Got the harbour view out the window. Got the best weather. All the Brits are coming. They want to be in Sydney. Yet you wanted something different. Yeah, what was going on, Matt? What kind of got you thinking about moving overseas for such a long period of time?
Yeah, it's a funny one because when you describe it like that, it sounds like, yeah, Sydney sounds great, and it was great. Like I was having a great time. I was in my teens and just kind of living life and having fun. I think it had got to a point, I think, where I had felt like, I don't know, I'd been growing in my role at work, and I just thought I needed to do something different. And I'd actually had a couple of friends of mine who were colleagues as well, who had done something similar. They'd moved to the US and the UK and a few things like that. And I just felt it was something that I'd always wanted to do, was to have the opportunity to kind of get out there and, I don't know, see the world a bit. I mean, I'd traveled, but I hadn't really immersed myself properly in that way. And I just thought I knew it would be a challenge. I certainly underestimated the challenge, but I also wanted to do something that would challenge me in that way. And I felt it was just about, I'd always wanted to live in Europe. I'd always wanted to really kind of immerse myself in Europe. And I thought, well, this is a really good opportunity. I thought it would be a good way for me to kind of get out there and push the boundaries a little bit. I think in Australia, we get very caught up with things here, and we focus a lot on all the stuff and the nitty gritty and the politics and whatnot of what's happening here. And we forget about, there's a lot of stuff going on outside of Australia. And to be honest, relatively speaking, we're a pretty small country. So it kind of got me out of that bubble a little bit to go, oh, actually, there's a lot going on out here.
So day one in Germany.
Yeah, gosh.
What's happening?
I remember it was because it was coming towards the end of summer, but it was a really unusual year that year. Summer seemed to just be running forever. And I think it even was by September and October, it was still, quite warm. So for me, when I first arrived, I was quite excited. I was like, oh gosh, like weather's great. Everyone complains about the weather in Europe, and I was like, I don't know what they're all talking about. But it was one of these just really unusual years where they had a very long summer. It was great in that sense when I first arrived because, I was getting out and about. But my first day, I stayed my first night in a hotel. And then the next day, someone from the company came and met me from HR and took me to a small apartment that the company had sort of provided for me before I, settled in. And it was great. It was a very small, just, one bedroom apartment in a good central district in the city. And I remember her showing me around and saying, okay, well, here's the basement with the laundry and here's all the bits and pieces. And then I was kind of just left to my own devices. I was just a bit like, oh, okay, now what? And I thought, okay, I've got this giant suitcase. Well, okay, let's put things in the wardrobe. And I just remember standing there going like, oh God, okay, well, there are no coat hangers. I'm going to need to buy some. But then I'm like, I don't know where to get them here. I don't know what the German word for coat hanger is. I don't even know where to start. And I had this it was such a stupid thing about buying coat hangers, but it just really all of a sudden hit me to go, oh, shit, what have I done? I was a bit like this, kind of a bit emotionally overwhelmed, and was like, I just have to get out of here and go for a walk and clear my head because I just, until that point, had not really comprehended kind of what I was really doing. Like it all just seemed like this adventure, and then I was like, my God, this is suddenly real. And it was just it was kind of my first encounter with like what would be many hurdles, that I would have to overcome, in terms of settling in and understanding the system. And and as you say, culture shock. There's definitely a cultural angle, but it's also just understanding how things work, because it's even though Germany is it's a developed country, and it's a it's a powerhouse economy of Europe and all these, but there are so many things that are just so different. And by comparison to Australia, I would say some things that I just felt were really kind of a little bit maybe almost backward in a way, or archaic from that perspective. But other things they were doing that were way more advanced. And it was just this kind of, it just took a lot to get your head around. I had a fantastic relationship, and I'm still in touch with my former boss from the team there. But I worked with fantastic people. They were all really really great, and they were very helpful because obviously language. My German when I first arrived was not great. I had also they all knew that I was there to learn, so basically would go into meetings and things would generally be in German, and I had to learn pretty fast.
Mm,
But the thing about the working culture that I think struck me was there is a very, very big divide between personal and professional life in Germany. Whereas in Australia, it's very normal for people to hang out, socialize with colleagues. Sometimes people even
mm,
do things outside of work hours, like on weekends or things, sometimes with their work
mm,
friends. Germany, I found, generally speaking, at least in my experience, that
mm,
people separated their personal and work lives more
mm,
so than they do in Australia. Um,
mm,
and even to the point where I remember even somebody was going on a holiday and I wanted to know where and what they were doing and just making conversation. And it was
mm,
almost, they didn't kind of tell me they weren't going to tell me, but it was almost like they were surprised that I would ask that question. It felt
mm.
like it was almost a very personal thing to be asking someone in a work environment when I just was like, I'm just making conversation.
Yeah.
So there was this very clear divide for some people that they just really did not want to blend their personal and work lives, and they didn't really discuss their personal lives with their colleagues. Whereas in Australia, feels like that is a much more fluid dynamic between kind of the personal and work life, where they cross over a lot more.
Yeah. Actually, I might ask a bit about that in a tick. I wanted to ask about working, yeah, how you worked in the early months, maybe even a year, as your language skills was growing.
Mm.
Because if you think about it, it's quite a remarkable environment and scenario. Like,
It was very difficult because I remember my first day, I think it was, I went into this meeting about a client. It was an internal meeting and it was in German. And I remember sitting there going, I have no idea what's going on. I'm catching every third word if I'm lucky here. And yeah, it was another one of these moments of like, oh my God, what am I doing? But I guess the
mm,
difference was one of the, I guess it's the English language privilege, you know.
mm, okay,
Eh, there is privilege when you are a native English speaker because English is so pronounced, so prominent as a global language. Everybody in that office spoke really
mm,
spoke excellent English, so
mm,
it wasn't such a. It was not like there was a barrier per se, and I
mm,
could very easily get by in a kind of German English hybrid for quite a while.
yeah, okay,
Um, but as I progressed, what happened was I made it a conscious effort. I really wanted to speak German
mm,
more,
yeah,
and I would often speak it, but I would find like even things like I would find writing emails quite difficult. So I usually
mm,
wrote emails in English just because grammar in German is, if you've ever studied German, it is very complex in this when it comes to grammar. And whilst you can kind of gloss over some of those things when it's spoken, when it's
mm,
written, it's really obvious if it's
mm.
wrong.
Deutsch zu lernen ist schwer, vor allem die Grammatik. Ich lerne schon seit Jahren Deutsch und habe regelmäßig das Gefühl, keine Fortschritte zu machen. Wie ist Matt vorangekommen? Well, if you speak German, you'll know exactly what I said. But if you're like most of us, including myself, that don't speak German, what I said is as follows. Learning German is hard, especially the grammar. I've been at it for years and regularly feel like I'm making no progress. How did Matt get on? Let's find out. Let's talk about the language a bit. So my experience in Germany and my wife, I mean, we probably got to. So I'm learning German now still, and
Mhm.
I'm probably B1. But I struggle in conversation still. I'm quite slow and all that kind of stuff. I mean, in Germany, we were people would we could do things in a service environment,
Mhm.
right? So we could order in a restaurant, we could pay at a supermarket, we could buy our fish from the weekend market and
Mhm.
so on. But if they asked us a question, we might be like stunned mullets for 10, 15 seconds while we processed what it
What was
was they
going
were
on?
asking and so on.
Yeah.
Many Germans speak very good English. However, at the same time, my experience was Germans were quite perfectionists, actually. So my analogy with Germany and China is that in China, you say a few words in Chinese and people are like, oh my God, this is brilliant. You speak Chinese, you're fluent. And like, they'll just like go to town. My experience in Germany is that you could be very good, but you could make a few, like errors common for a non-native, and you'd be caught up on that. Oh, that person's accent isn't right, or they made a few mistakes in their grammar. They're quite high standards, if you like, when it comes to quality.
Yeah.
So how did you go about? Because I remember you were telling me you were presenting in German in
By
your
the end of
time.
it, I
By
was.
the end of it,
Yeah. By
so
the
how did
end.
how did you go? What's I can't buy coat hangers to you're advising clients on their brand strategy. How did you learn?
Yeah.
And like, what did you do? Was it? Did you have tutors? Were you studying every day? How did you practically get there, Matt?
Yeah, so
Walk
I,
us through
I
that
I
journey.
did have a tutor. So
Right.
I had a tutor, but only for about 3 or 4 months though. It wasn't as though I
Mm,
had someone ongoing for a long period of time. I had a tutor for about 3 months, and then it was more about just immersing myself in the language. And
mm,
I used to try small things like I remember even just sitting on the U-Bahn and I would read the poster ads on the inside of the train
mm.
and I would read them and go, right, oh, actually, I don't know what that word is. And I would then have to look it up in my little, my app on my phone that had a translator in it. And I would just kind of do simple things like that to build my vocabulary. I would ask people to correct me at work. They would correct my
Right.
language and things.
Did people like doing that, or were they uncomfortable doing that?
They were okay doing it because I did it. They asked me to do the same for them in English.
Right. Okay.
And because I was the only native English speaker in the office, I became kind of the English language help desk. So
Right.
as soon as somebody had to put something together in a formal document, they would ask me to
Mm,
proofread it and
mm.
correct it. And
Yeah.
one of the
Right.
cha- one of the challenges I had with that was one of the things I think, at least in Germany, Germans have a very good understanding of language, probably because they also speak, that most of them are at least bilingual. They have a very structured and good understanding of grammar and, vocabulary and things like that. Whereas when I was looking at a document, that I would correct a sentence and they would say, why is it wrong? And I would struggle to explain why it was wrong. I said, well, actually, I don't know why it's wrong, but I can
Mm,
tell you that it doesn't sound correct. But if you write it this way, but to be able to
yeah.
articulate the rules in English, I actually found that quite difficult.
Yeah, I had
Um,
I had the same thing. So my wife, her first language is Chinese, so English is her second language, but she's been speaking it since she was young. So she can explain grammatically why something is, how to pronounce, why an English sentence should be so and so. Yeah, I've got no idea. And I
yeah.
found learning German really hard because
Mm,
I don't think in that grammatical rules way. So my wife, grammatically is very strong in German, but she just can't remember it and so isn't speaking it. Whereas
mm,
I remember all the vocab, but I can't get the grammar right
yeah,
because
I'm the same. I'm
do
very
you
good with the
know?
vocabulary, but the grammar
Yeah,
I really struggle with.
yeah, exactly. The trick isn't the trick to speak always in the plural and the polite form, and then you take away a lot of ambiguity. That was
It
the hack
depends,
I heard.
yeah. And there's also then that I think a cultural thing around always assume it's the polite form, depending on the
Mm,
person you're speaking to, of course. But
yeah,
yes, there are lots of little tricks that you start to learn about how to structure a sentence because even though
yeah,
it's not always the rule, it's usually the rule and there are some exceptions and you kind of just run with it and
yeah.
80% of the time you'll be fine.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and and Matt, how did you, this is fascinating. How did you make the leap from, overcome the chasm of kind of, academic learning, you're reading, you're writing, you get it, to actually speaking and engaging? Because that's a transition that I think for a language learner is always a big, a big milestone
Mm.
where you're just confident engaging and confident in your mistake. Tell us about that process.
Yeah, I remember there was I can tell you the exact time it actually almost happened in a way. I was at a coffee shop at Tegel Airport in Berlin. I was in Berlin for a work meeting and I went to order a coffee and I ordered my coffee and kind of on I went and I stopped and I said to my colleague who I was with, I said, that is the first time I have ordered something, done something, engaged in a service environment in German and not have the person respond to me in English.
Right.
Like it was that, and I was like, okay, I've kind of
Wow.
crossed that barrier. They no longer treat me like a foreigner. Um,
Wow.
and I don't know if it was getting the accent a little better or what it was, I don't know. But I actually found the whole, like the way I learn, and maybe this is just me, is by doing. So I was very much just like trying to speak as much as possible, trying to listen. I used to sit in public sometimes and try and eavesdrop on people's conversations and in my head try and translate them and go like, what are they talking about?
Yeah, wow.
Just little things like that. And sometimes I would get it, sometimes I wouldn't. But it was just, I was constantly trying to, to practice and improve. And I think even though you were right, I think there is a certain perfection around language in Germany. A lot of Germans were also very grateful that I was trying, because I think especially in cities like Frankfurt that are very international, and you have a lot of people from native English speaking backgrounds there, from the UK, US, Canada, Australia, etc., who lived there for many years and make no attempt to learn German. And I think it sometimes surprised people. Someone from Australia would make an effort, So
Yeah.
it was. I think there was a bit of I think people were grateful or liked the fact that someone like myself would try and kind of lean into the language and come to get to grips with kind of a true kind of
Yeah.
experience of being in their country.
What are some other crazy stories that baffled you, or gaffes you made, or something in Germany for our listeners?
Probably one of the So pronunciation is always an important part of any language, and so I remember going to a bakery on my way to work one morning, and there is a pastry you can buy in Germany, which is it's like a small little crescent-shaped pastry, like the shape of a croissant, but it's not a croissant, and it has like walnuts and things on top of it, and it's called Nusshörnchen, which basically is like a nut horn, basically, because it looks like a horn kind of
Nuss,
shaped.
Nusshörnchen. Okay.
Nusshörnchen. I asked for a Nusshähnchen, which is a chicken. And this woman at the bakery looked at me as if I was like some kind of like crazy person. She looked at me and she's like, "What are you talking about?" Like, yeah. So there were many, many faux pas like that where I said stupid things like that. For me, I was like, Nusshörnchen, Nusshähnchen. To me, it sounded the same.
Surely they know what you're asking for. It's a
She
bakery.
did, but she basically looked at me as if to say, like, you want a chicken? Like, what are you talking about? A nutty chicken?
There are three things I remember when we got to Germany that just struck me as like really unusual for some reason. The first one was that you had to have your name on the letterbox, and that they wouldn't deliver the mail if the name on the letterbox didn't match the name on the letter, even if the address was the same. And we were renting in a village called Limburgerhof, and we hadn't yet put our names on the letterbox. The owners who we were renting from, it was still there. And so I had a knock on the door from this very friendly middle-aged post woman. And I had, my German was, like A0 when we first got there. And we're trying gestures and this and that. And like, I ended up getting my passport and like kind of putting it next to my face and going, "See, look, it's me," and all kinds of stuff. So that was number one. Number two was our first meal in Germany. I think it was even our first evening, and looking at the menu and just going, "Where are the vegetables?" Like everything was meat.
Meat and potatoes.
And I'll come back to my attitude to German food later, because I love it now. But at that first day, I was like, "Oh my God." Thirdly, and this would be a funny one, never stand behind a German in a supermarket who's ordering cheese, because they will order like 20 grams of 27 varieties and want to taste them all before they buy. It just took forever. The other thing that I also found really interesting in Germany, which is actually where they're very flexible, is when you go to a restaurant and you want to pay and they'll always ask you, "Zusammen oder getrennt?" Like, is it together or separate? So in Australia, as you walk into a restaurant in Australia, like there's many in Melbourne, probably in Sydney, right?
Yeah.
This huge sign, no split bills. It's this weird thing, right? Whereas in Germany, they kind of want you to. Did you find that?
I loved that about Germany. I thought that was so great, coming from Sydney, where splitting bills was like splitting hairs. And it was just, I agree, like going into restaurants here in Sydney and asking to split the bill, sometimes you get a look, the expression you get back sometimes is like you've asked them to cut their own arm off or something. But in Germany, it was just the norm. Like nobody even bats an eyelid. And I loved that the wait staff in Germany, again, it's all cash. They will go to each person around the table and they will each say, "I had these items," and you'll pay for that. They'll give you your change and they'll move to the next person. "I had these items." And it's fantastic. I thought it was great. There was one Sunday in Germany, I remember I think it was like in February. It was cold. It was freezing. Like it
Mm,
was minus something, but it was sunny. It was really like bright sunny day, but cold, like crisp
mm,
Sunday. And the entire city was outside. Like
mm.
everyone was out. And I went and had like Sunday brunch with some friends and we sat outside all rugged up under a heater with our coats and everything on because it was sunny. And
Mm.
like I thought, God, people in Australia, I think we're absolutely crazy sitting out here because it's freezing. But it was the first time we'd seen the sun in so long that everyone was just like, the entire city came alive. It was fantastic.
Oh, brilliant. What was the motivation, or what was the spark that led you to go, hey, you know what? I'm ready to go home.
Well, it was funny. Before I was saying how I didn't really feel at home in Sydney. When I was away, made a trip to come back to visit a couple of times. And it was during one of those visits I was in Sydney with some friends. And I thought, this now feels much more like home to me. When I lived in Sydney at the time, it did not. But then when I went away and then kind of came back to visit, just by nature of compare and contrast, Sydney felt so much more home for me. And I started to think about, actually, Sydney's a pretty great city. I'm enjoying my time in Europe, but like,
Mm.
what's my long-term plan? Do I want to stay there like long term? Is
Mm.
that what I want? My family, I'm quite close with my family.
Mm.
Um, the weather enormously better. It's in
All
Sydney.
right.
The climate here is a little bit, it's we don't get those kind of grey, awful January days you get in Europe. So
True.
there was a lot around that sort of thing. Don't be wrong, I do miss the European summers, which
Well,
are
I,
fantastic.
I was just about to say it's really hard to beat a European summer, isn't
Yeah.
it? Did you find what you were looking for there? And what was that? What did you take away? So it was 3 years in Germany, is that
Yeah,
right?
I was there for 3 years.
Yeah.
I took away a lot.
Mm.
I think I don't want to say I became a different person, but I evolved, I think, a
Mm.
lot over those 3 years. It taught me a lot about resilience. And I think having grown up guess I'd moved from the South Coast to Sydney, but my entire life kind of existed in a very small space of, it's a 2 hour drive, like it's not
Mm.
like things are that far away. And all of a sudden you're kind of thrust to the other side of the world on your own without any kind of friends or network, and you kind of got to make it by yourself. It does teach you a lot about resilience and kind
Mm.
of, just getting on with it a bit.
Mm.
So I think it
Yeah.
helped me a lot in that respect. And it taught me a lot about, it opened my eyes to the world. Like as I said, I had traveled before, but
Mm.
you kind of look at Australia in a different light when you're away, because I think in Australia we get very caught up with things here and we focus a lot on all the stuff and the nitty-gritty and the politics and whatnot of what's happening here.
What advice would you give a young professional from not necessarily just Australia, but a young professional who, similar to yourself before Germany? What kind of advice would you give if they're umming and ahhing about, should I do something like this? Or, there's a path here, it's pretty clear. Well, yeah, like, what would you tell? What kind of
I think
advice?
they should absolutely do it. People ask me the question, are you glad you did it? And to this day, I always say it is one of, if not the best decision I ever made, was to go and live in Germany. I gained so much from it, not
Mm.
just in terms of my personal kind of growth and things and being able to learn to speak German and all these sorts of things, but the friends I made. I have this incredible network of amazing people who I'm friends with to this day, some of whom are still in Germany. A lot are not. They've kind of scattered around the world over the last sort of few years, but I'm still super close with them all. And I have I have all those relationships with great people that if I hadn't gone, I would never have. And I would say also, if people are thinking about and they're umming and ahhing about doing something like that, giving it a go. Worst case scenario, you don't like it, you hate it, you come back. It's not
Mm.
like it's not a permanent decision that you have
Mm.
to commit yourself to.
Mm.
And when I went, I didn't know how long I was going to go for. I had no idea. I thought
Mm.
I at least wanted to do a year. I was like,
Yeah.
there's no point in me going if I'm not going to stick out at least a year.
Yeah.
I ended up staying for 3. And yeah, I just think there's so much to gain. And you've got, especially if you're in your 20s and things like that, you've really got nothing to lose.
Now, Matt, the question all our listeners are dying to know, and we can kind of ease out of this podcast episode with this piece of critical information, which is, how do you say coat hanger in German?
Aufhänger. Kleideraufhänger or Mantelaufhänger.
There you go, everyone. Kleideraufhänger or Mantelaufhänger. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a brilliant story, very inspiring, and just absolutely brilliant to listen and learn from you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad to do it. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Wayfinders. See you next time, everyone. Bye-bye.